So, good morning, everyone. Today, I'd like, and specifically this morning, I'd like to speak about decision-making in daily living and how that fits into the notion that everything is predetermined and that we're not the doers. Because in practical terms, life unfolds through decisions being made very regularly in life. But before I do that, I'd like to just refresh, not so much about the daily living side of things, but the bigger picture part of the framework that talks about what life is from a bigger picture point of view. And from that place, we can then drop into the daily living and specifically decision making. And later on, we can talk about actually dropping into the body and feeling more, doing what we feel like. And that can transition into a discussion about starting to feel the energies of doership and attachment to outcome. What I mean by the energies is energy suppressed in the body in which the beliefs are contained. So emotions and energies based on past events that were related to with the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And when that store is contained in the body, that is essentially where the beliefs are contained. And for as long as it remains in the system, we're forced to continue to see life through that lens. So a bigger picture point of view, and this is where we can start to see one aspect of why this is a non-dual teaching, although it's a non-dual teaching from, by the most part, the ground up rather than the top down, which is a lot of non-dual teachings will approach the subject from the top down, talking about our true nature as consciousness, whereas from the bottom up, we are talking about it and approaching it from a daily living perspective. Both are valid and they actually can come in and support each other. So the notion is that prior to the manifestation, before any of this existed, before the universe existed, the universe being part of the manifestation, in very practical terms, the manifestation is what is in front of us right now, the life experience and the life setting that we find ourselves in each moment. So for all intents and purposes, this is the manifestation. From a broader perspective, the manifestation is the whole universe. And if it was a multiverse, then the manifestation is all of the universes, not just this universe. So essentially it means the manifestation is everything. And where did the everything come from? What is its source? And in this framework and in traditional non-dual teachings, the assertion is that everything came from nothing. Shiva turned into Shiva Shakti. Shiva being energy at rest or potentiality, at some point actualizes and manifests and becomes duality, Shiva Shakti instead of just Shiva. And Shiva Shakti is energy in movement. So the manifestation is energy that was previously at rest, energy that we could say was potential energy that has actualized, turned into, become everything. So we could look at it, if you like, that the point at which the unmanifest, that's another word that we can use for consciousness at rest or source at rest, the unmanifest. The point at which the unmanifest turns into the manifest in the materialist model would be the Big Bang. So the immense creative potentiality, bubbling energy, explodes into manifestation. And at any point, of the manifestation, that is the manifestation. Even though it's continually changing and said to be expanding and growing, we can see, based on our observation of the manifestation that we're aware of, that it is a manifestation of change, a manifestation of growth, and a manifestation of evolution. It's very clear, if we look at it, we don't have to hold these definitions as absolute, but from one perspective it's very clear that life is an evolution. We can see how organisms have come into existence where previously there weren't organisms, how the organisms have become more complex, whereas previously they were more simple. There has been technological evolution, industrial evolution, all sorts of evolution, an evolution of conscious understanding of who we are. And from one perspective, we could say that the movement towards knowing ourselves more fully, the movement towards peace of mind in daily living, is part of the evolutionary process. Humans came into existence. At some point, they needed to struggle with the task at hand, which was simple survival. They needed to struggle with surviving in the elements, surviving with nature around them. They were concerned about not being eaten by tigers and other creatures that could kill them. They were concerned with setting up systems such that they could feed themselves. As a growing population grew, foraging and finding food in nature may not have been sufficient to feed the whole community. And so there was an evolution. And at some point there was an evolution to survive on Earth. And we can see that by and large we don't need to worry about those things anymore. That evolution has got us to a point where at least us sitting here are fortunate enough to be above the poverty line. Although many people in life are still below the poverty line, there is the understanding of how to survive in life, in the collective consciousness. And so we don't need to put our attention on basic survival anymore. And so the next part of the evolution, in order for life to become more optimal, so at the point when we couldn't survive comfortably because we didn't have appropriate shelter or defense mechanisms against nature, then that was what needed to be developed in order for life to be more optimal. Now we're surviving in life. The next phase is to survive happily. And we can see that throughout history there have been little awakenings where humanity has evolved to a point where there's a realization that, for example, suffering is attitudinal, that suffering is not circumstantial. So the Buddha left his palace in order to inquire, and as a result of his inquiry, his contemplation, certain realizations came about. So we could say that that is evolution happening on a new level, not of survival, but of knowing oneself or surviving happily. And not only the Buddha, but many other people throughout history were starting to exhibit this interest and understand. So there start to be blips of new ways of seeing or living coming into the collective consciousness. And as more and more of those lights shine up, it's an indication that evolution is happening. Evolution happens gradually and slowly. And so those are the forefathers of the evolutionary wave that I have little doubt at some point will take full force, and it will be a standard thing for humanity, assuming we survive long enough, to live happily as a default. That the ingrained misunderstanding that evolution has put up in place up to now will not be sustained going forward. So, the unmanifest, absolute nothing, no creation, no question of evolution, becomes the manifest, the story of life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, and everything in between is part of that story of life. The source has become the story. It hasn't created a story outside of itself. God isn't inflicting pain on you and me, but God has become you and me and everything else, and created the story where pain is inflicted by one component on another component, but that is part of the overall story unfolding. Why not? Why not that story? Just like a horror movie is said to be a valid expression of art as a genre in film. And so are the different forms of film, comedy and drama, action. And so if Source in its unmanifest form is infinite creative potentiality, why wouldn't this be a valid expression? And when we look at it, we can't deny it is hugely creative if it's a story. On many, many levels, we can see the amazing complexity on the level of nature and the complexity in the framework, the physics of this framework of life. And when we look at that complexity and see the creativity in it, we really have to marvel at the mystery of where this comes from. So if we start looking at life as a creation, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, we can then, which we might be able to understand if we look at it from the perspective that the unmanifest has become the manifest. Everything in the manifestation is part of the one creation, made of the one source, not separate from the one source, essentially, fundamentally the same. And physics is demonstrating this. If we look deeply enough, we find that the differentiation which is on the surface is no longer there at a deep enough level. So fundamentally, everything is of the same stuff, made of the same energy, consciousness, we could say. And so once that big picture is presented, we can then move down to the level of basic daily living, understanding that what happens in daily living is part of the creation, that nothing that happens in daily living is separate from what has been created. Now, if we don't like the idea that everything is arising as a story in consciousness, we can just look at it from a Big Bang point of view and say, well, an explosion happened and life is a result. Life in each moment is that explosion moving forward, just like a bomb explodes, and at any point in time all the shrapnel is in a certain place, and then a second later it's somewhere else and things are bumping into each other. And when the initial explosion has expended itself, the energy from the initial explosion has expended itself, then everything will be still and land in a configuration completely determined by the initial impulse and how everything moved from that initial impulse. And so life at each moment is that movement out from the initial impulse. So what is daily living? Daily living essentially is interhuman relationship. That's key to the story of life, interhuman relationship, at least as we know it. And the question that's suggested, and we spoke a lot about this, is what in practical terms, are we really looking for? And when we come down to it, if we go past all of our ideas that sometimes are altruistic and idealistic, and we're really honest, we say, actually, to be truthful, to be frank, and this becomes much more obvious if we get tired from the struggle. That, to be honest, all I'm looking for is to be happy. We have a lot of expectations and ideas about what will bring that happiness about. So if we say, maybe I don't know whether all of the things that I think that I need to save the world, or that the world needs to be different, or that I need this and that. That's what I believe will give me happiness. That's why I want it. I would like these things to happen because ultimately I believe that if that happens, it'll give me happiness. And I don't know, to be honest. I just want to be happy. And then we look at the human condition and we find that our unhappiness is much less circumstantial than we might have thought, much more attitudinal. And at the base of the attitude that is currently in place, that delivers a struggle and a resistance and uncomfortableness with life, the base of the current attitude, when suffering is still part of everyday experience, is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And so what is the attitude going to be when unhappiness is no longer there? When what we could call peace of mind, which is the ground on which unhappiness stands, the ground which is covered up by this uncomfortableness that fills daily life. It will be we could call it the attitude of the heart, because it's not a mental attitude like the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. It's not the replacement of doership and attachment to outcome attitude, which is a whole lot of beliefs. It's not a replacement with a new set of beliefs that are different. It's the falling away of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And what replaces it is a way of living life where the beingness of the human, which exists prior to thinking, so we don't need to, if we say, well, if I drop my attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, well, then I need a new attitude, don't I? I need a new belief system. That would be a conclusion of the thinking mind, when the thinking mind doesn't appreciate that there's some other energy, some other force that is present prior to our attitude that will function, that does function, regardless of whether we have a mental interpretation of life or not. So the falling away of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome reveals something that is here, we could say has always been here, that is more real, actually, more authentic, more genuine than any belief system we could have. And at the core of that which is prior to thought, the core of that is the very sense of existence. I am, I exist. So we don't need to think I am. We don't need to create an idea of who I am in order for this sense of existence to be here. And not only is there a sense of existence that exists prior to thought, there is awareness. And not only is there awareness, but there is awareness of the world. We don't need to bring this into creation. We don't need to comment on it in order for it to be. And so that sense of existence, the sense I am, I'm alive, I'm here, which is not a thought-based sense. The awareness and the presence of a body with all of its preferences and its emotions and its thoughts and its feelings, all of that just is, and it moves automatically. It unfolds as part of the moving story of life. We don't have the job of needing to make life unfold. So, with this recognition that life has always been moving, it's never been me that has been making life turn out a particular way, then the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which was an interpretation of how life was unfolding, an interpretation that said, I am the one that makes life turn out a certain way, rather than recognizing that life is a momentum much bigger than you or me. You and me and everyone else is part of the momentum. We're being lived. We're being moved by life. So when the attitude, which is also part of life, falls away, the false attitude that I am making life happen, there's a relaxation. We get to go along for the ride, but without feeling that we are controlling the ride. And so then that becomes the attitude, which we could call the attitude of non-doership, but really it's the attitude of our natural state, which is the absence of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. So once again, not the gaining of anything, but the falling away of a false interpretation of who we are and what life is. And life will continue to unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. It always has been doing that. If it was different to this, if the belief in doership and attachment to outcome falls away and someone loses that, then they would be forced to just remain as a statue, unable to move, if it wasn't life moving us. So this is why so much, and that's not the case when the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome falls away. The reports and the observation that we have is that that individual continues to live life perfectly functionally, often much more effectively and efficiently than before. The reports from the individuals themselves is that life is abundant and synchronistic, and there's a flow to it. There's a magic that happens when the controller, the mental control belief, gets out of the way. And so we can see that life must be happening due to a bigger force. We're being lived. This is why all the emphasis is on a surrender to God's will. Everything is a happening according to God's will. I'm not the doer, you're not the doer. Everything is a happening according to God's will. Now, the word God, which is why I don't throw it in too often, is very loaded. We have a definition of God that has been rammed down our throats in some cases. A definition of a God that is different to the God that I'm speaking of. So we don't need to use the word God. We can say life or source, because life has come out of some source. Everything is happening according to impersonal life, or according to source. Or actually, we can call it God, if we're aware that we're not talking about a God out there who is looking down on us and saying, oh, you're doing a very good job or a very bad job, and I'm going to reward you or punish you. A God that is separate, a God that on the one hand is said to have complete domain over everything that happens, and on the other hand is going to punish us for what we've done wrong. It doesn't make sense. We have to drop some of these concepts. If God has complete domain over everything that happens, if we can't function accept according to God's will, what's he going to punish us for? We're doing his will. There's no reason to fear the God that I'm talking about. The God I'm talking about has become everything, has become the movement, the actions, has become the duality, the good and the evil, which only look like good and evil from a certain perspective. From a bigger perspective, it's part of a completely balanced whole. A story of duality, a story of time and space, a story of separation or perceived separation, a story of forgetting ourselves and suffering arising, a story of, at some point, that forgetfulness, the divine hypnosis being lifted, and a remembering happening, the separation falling away, the recognition of that we're never separate from life, that life is always functioning as it's destined to function. And then with that, the hatred towards the other falls away. The seeing the other as a competitor and as a rival falls away. The struggle with life as it is falls away. So, in theory, though this is an example, if we were to die and then go and meet God, but remembering there isn't a separate God that we're going to go and meet anyway, but to make the point, if we stand in front of God, God's going to say, wow, you did such a great job. High five. To everyone. Because God understands that everyone is functioning precisely as they are created to function, destined to function, in order for life to turn out exactly the way it's destined to turn out. At this moment, life is perfect from the perspective of how it's turning out. Why is it that there's something deep inside that says, no, it's not? The poverty shouldn't be here. The political situation shouldn't be here. I'd suggest that it's that strong reaction happens because there is a deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes that life has inserted as part of the bigger picture. In order for a forgetting oneself to happen, in order for a resistance and a separation, a perceived image of how life should be compared to how it is, and then a resistance. It's all part of the forgetting oneself. It's all part of the uncomfortableness with oneself. So if we hear that life is perfectly imperfect, basically the way it is the only way it could be. And there's something inside, no, there shouldn't be the atrocities that are happening in life. If that arises with a sense of uncomfortableness, an uncomfortableness of self, then consider that it's a result of a deeply ingrained belief of who we are and what life is, different to the concept that's being put forward here. Now, that's not to say that with a particular understanding, everything becomes the same, becomes equal. It's not to say that pleasure and pain fall away and that there's there is indifference between pleasure and pain. On a biological level, no matter how deep the understanding, pleasure is still going to be pleasurable and pain painful. That situations in life are going to be tragic. And with this understanding, when we say life is perfect, it doesn't mean that we look at a tragic situation and can't appreciate the tragicness. But that situation, that tragicness, is seen in a bigger context, and more specifically, the reaction that happened below the sadness, because sadness will still arise when unfortunate circumstances happen. But the suffering that so often arises, that goes much deeper than sadness, a sense that this is an attack on who I am, will no longer be able to arise if the identity from which that feeling arose has dissolved. Now, I'm not talking about the dissolving of the person. I'm not talking about the dissolving of the ego. As you might remember, the definition in this teaching is we are the person. We are the ego. So the ego here means the person. And what, in practical terms, if we define it, what is the person? The person must be ultimately source. But how does that express itself? The person is clearly made up of a body instrument, so the body is one component, and there is a component of consciousness. The consciousness, we could say, comes from, or is the consciousness of source. So we have really three important components that make up the person. You have ultimately the consciousness of source, impersonal consciousness. We have the body, which is an object, a biological instrument, and the consciousness of source links to, identifies to the body, identifies to it with a particular name and form. Now, the way that I'm using the word identify here isn't the problem. It's not the separation. It's not the mistake. That's how the person, the individual, comes into existence. It's what the individual is. Impersonal consciousness of source, an object, the body, the linking of the consciousness to the body object, and then the magic happens, the personal consciousness experience. What you and I are experiencing right now is the personal consciousness experience, which is part and parcel of the person. So from this perspective, we can say, the person is not separate from source. That the personal consciousness, what we are aware of right now, effectively is source having this experience. Impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, an object. We could say the vehicle through which consciousness functions and experiences life from this perspective. And this perspective of life is personal consciousness.
Is that the third thing?
Yes.
That's the third thing?
So, if you don't mind, because it's good for the recording.
No, you were saying the three aspects of a person.
Yes.
One, consciousness itself.
Impersonal consciousness.
Impersonal consciousness.
Yep.
The other, the body.
An object, yes.
And the third is the personal consciousness?
Yes. Okay. That's essentially what the human being, the person, is, according to this conceptual framework. We can start looking at ourselves as that is what we are.
And there's a linking that you mentioned. The linking is this linking between the impersonal consciousness and impersonal consciousness.
Either linking or identification. We can use either word. Now, that's how, if the impersonal consciousness didn't identify itself with a particular vehicle, then it wouldn't have the experience from that perspective, and the person wouldn't exist. So the linking or the identification is essential in order for daily living, which is interhuman relationship, to happen. And the impersonal consciousness has linked or identified to 6 billion, 7 billion unique objects. in order to have 7 billion unique personal consciousness experiences, all of which in this story are interacting and interrelating with each other. So that's what the ego is in this teaching. We don't have an ego that we need to get rid of. We are the ego. And the body, the object, has its design, its makeup, its preferences, its genes, and its conditioning. And that's what gives the personal consciousness a very particular flavor. It's what contributes to the personal consciousness experience. And the ego or the person will have, by default or generally speaking, included in it as part of its genes and up-to-date conditioning, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. This process works specifically on undoing or dissolving the component of the human being that is additional to what is there when liberation happens, let's say. So liberation is simply the dissolving of a certain component of the person, the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which then allows us to recognize our connection to Source. So the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome essentially cuts off our connection to Source, or more accurately, cuts off our recognition of our connection to Source. We're never really disconnected from Source. If a human being were disconnected from Source, they would collapse and essentially be dead. So whether we recognize or not our connection to Source is crucial. It's always there. And the process is about bringing us to recognize what we really are at our core, what the human being at its core is, the consciousness that's functioning through the body that makes up part of the person, a fundamental part of the person, is unrecognized by and large.
Sorry, but so you're saying that hypothesis that it's the doership, this doership and attachment to outcome, is the main block in a sense to understanding our connection to Source.
Sure, because the doership says, what does it say? I am a separate, individual entity in complete control of everything I think, feel, say, and do. So what it psychologically creates is an insulation around me and an insulation around the other as a separate, independent entity, which is something we can never be, something we aren't. But that belief system is effectively the separation.
Is that what in other Advaita teachings is called ignorance?
Yes.
Sounded familiar.
It's the ignorance, the ignorance, to ignore, ignorance, the ignorance of what I am at my core. The misunderstanding. Ignorance is a mistake. The misunderstanding of what I am. To know myself as a separate independent entity in complete control of everything I think, feel, say, and do is a mistake. And it doesn't recognize the formless. When we live life with that idea of ourself, essentially we know ourself as form, as the body, exclusively as the body. So when something happens to the body, it is taken automatically, not something that we might consciously do, but the feeling inside is a feeling of attack on who I am. Now, if we were in an accident and our limbs were lost, very unfortunate in terms of circumstance. But and our identification with being the body can create a mental story that fills the system with uncomfortableness because I have been attacked very grossly. My idea of myself has been attacked very grossly. I am now not complete on a physical level anymore. Whereas if a deeper understanding of what I am is there, we can wake up and find ourselves from one day to the next physically not as capable, physically different, and realize, what I am at my core is untouched by that. Now, that only happens if the resistance, the suffering, is not automatically triggered by the fact that that ingrained belief is there and the circumstances as it is. If that's the case, what I'm talking about is going to sound like some sort of wishful thinking. It's like, oh yeah, it's great in theory, but in practice, we don't feel that way. But we don't feel like that because there is an identity, a self-image, a belief of what I am that is out of line with what I am. And so that gets triggered by the changes on a circumstantial level. When we do drop into being, we can find that even if something very unfortunate on a circumstantial level is happening, we can find that part inside of ourselves that is I am. That not the thought I am, just that impersonal feeling of existence that is unchanged. It's the same impersonal sense of I am that we have when we're 2 years old or 10 years old, 30, 60, 80, 100. But it is so easily obscured. It is such a subtle sense that if it's unknown, if it hasn't presented itself to us, if life hasn't brought about a self-realization, a realization of self. So self is the consciousness that is identified and functioning through the body object. If life hasn't brought a realization of that self, then there is only a knowing oneself on a physical level. The associated beliefs that say, I am this, what else am I? I am this, body, and in control are in place, and therefore there's a whole lot of noise covering up the self, which is why the process is often very structured. Traditional teachings are very structured because they deal with what's in the way of self-realization methodically. And in that process, there is often a lot of practice of detachment, for example. The detachment process or renunciation process is a process of, for a while, pushing away pleasure. And so we can take an example of a Buddhist monk that goes off into a monastery and their head is shaved, their fancy clothes are taken away and they put on a robe, they're given rice and a little bit of miso soup or something, hard bed, cold showers, and that becomes their life. They renunciate, no sex. So they renounce the pleasures. And the process is a process that at some point the monk might be walking through the forest, the sun, early morning, shining through the trees, and the warm rays land on his face, and he feels it and closes his eyes, and then realizes, I am. In this moment, I exist. I am, even with the shaved head and the simple clothes and the hard bed and the simple food and no sex. I am. Something that is covered up when there is the identification with all of these things as needed. So that's why renunciation is to take away the things that we've become attached to. Take them away, and after a while you realize I still am, even without these things. I exist. And with that realization going deep, grounding into that realization, the monk at some point can say, oh, I can give back my robes to the head monk. I'm going back out into life to now fully live life, where I can enjoy sex and good food and soft bed and hot showers as part of the flow of life, part of the pleasure of life. But without the misunderstanding that that is what I need in order to be. And so in some of the Indian texts, the unenlightened person is known as a bhogi. Bhogi is an enjoyer of pleasure. So that's the unenlightened. And it makes sense to us. Oh, that's because there's attachment to pleasure, a belief that my completeness is to be found in gaining things. And so the unenlightened person is enjoying as much as they can. And in the same texts, the enlightened person is sometimes referred to as a mahabhogi. Now, maha means super, a super enjoyer. And we scratch our head, go, hang on, the unenlightened is a bhogi, an enjoyer. So if the enlightened person is a super enjoyer, doesn't that make them super unenlightened? But in fact, it's no. So why is this? It's because the attachment to outcomes, the attachment to pleasure has fallen away. They no longer feel identified by what is happening in circumstance, no longer take the look that the other person gives them, the glaring look, as an attack on who I am, and is therefore able to fully enjoy the pleasure when it is available in life. That means to see that life is going to present pleasure. The flow of life is both pleasure and pain. So they enjoy it fully without the interfering thoughts, what will this be like when it ends? I don't want it to end. What can I do to protect it? And we all know you're on holiday, and it's a 10-day holiday, and day 7 starts to become a bit shaky. And then it's day 8, it's, I've got to go back to work. I don't want to go back to work. If only I could stay on holiday for another 10 days. And so your last 2 days aren't fully enjoyed because we're already worried about what's going to happen when it changes. So the liberated person, no longer attached to outcomes, is able to fully enjoy pleasure and is forced, like everyone else, to endure pain. But with the same understanding, this pain is not an attack on who I am at my core.
What you're talking about makes me think of my mother as she got old, and I took care of her for about 5 years at home until I couldn't, and she went into a nursing home. She was a very narcissistic, very willful woman when she was younger, but as she got older, all that just dissipated, it went away. And it seemed like Source does this as part of the evolution. As we get older, this sense of personal doership and attachment to outcome just naturally kind of, because I would go see her in the rest home, and there would be some people, some of these women must have had really hard lives because they were bitter to the end, just nasty, bitter women. But most of them had that look that they still maintained their minds. They had awareness and function, but my mother wasn't extremely religious. She made us go to Presbyterian church every Sunday for 12 years, but she never thumped the Bible and all that. But as she got older, she would just say, if I went to her upset about something at work, she would say, turn it over to God. Now, I really believe that when she said that, she wasn't talking about this judgmental Bible God. She was talking about Source.
Mm-hmm.
Because as people get older, they just naturally get closer to Source. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I have to jump in and say and qualify it. It's not a default movement, because as you said, there were some of those people that didn't get closer to Source. or a recognition because they were still bitter. But it can very well happen once certain faculties of the mind actually stop functioning, that we do exactly
Okay.
as you say. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
It's not a guarantee. Many people die frustrated. I mean, even Mother Teresa was said to, in her later years, feel frustrated at the fact that why hasn't Jesus come to visit me? She dedicated her whole life. And so she was old, and if you looked at her, she's a saint in the world. Saint and enlightenment, not necessarily the same thing. A saint is someone who functions by and large for the very best of everyone else. An enlightened person is not necessarily going to be a saint. And so this saint, Mother Teresa, still exhibited on the outside, and we can't be sure, a frustration with the fact that she had dedicated her whole life to Jesus and he hasn't come to visit her. So, this natural aging process is not necessarily going to give us peace of mind on an absolute level. But, we get to a point where it becomes futile to try and control things when we're really sick, worrying about all our tax returns and all of that. If we're about to, it's like, I don't need to worry about it, and it falls away. And so certain things can become obvious to us. There's like, we get forced into surrender. I can't control this. I can't do all the things that I thought I needed to do. And when that gets taken away, we might find a natural peace kick in.
Just because as you age, naturally, your perceptions, your senses start to go. Cataracts, you don't hear as well, you can't walk well. So as that starts to dissipate, you do retract more and more to just the core being I am. Like you were saying, if your arms are gone, there's still that left.
Well, unless the dissipating of those functions creates a strong bitterness, right? A strong attachment to why is this happening? Well,
Right.
so it is grace if it happens.
Right.
But you saw it firsthand, right?
Right.
In your mother. So
Right.
in that case, you'd have to say, especially given you said she started off with a sort of different disposition, that it really is grace that in her case she got much more peaceful or accepting.
I just find that elderly people as a whole, if they lived comfortable lives, per se, as they get older, they just mellow into this more at peace with being. And they haven't gone through that night of the dark soul that leads to wandering around in a park for 2 years kind of a thing, not knowing who you are because you're so blissed out on it. You just age into it. I don't know.
No, I think it clearly can happen that way. Yeah.
Just too tired.
I think research shows that people are more happy after 50.
Yeah. So research. We can. Very important not to be absolute about these things, right?
Of course.
It's going to be very different for two different people, but in general, we could say that there's more occurrence of, let's say, people as they get older. But really, it's very important. If this is going to happen, it's because life has undone certain beliefs and certain attachments. So it's very clear, if someone feels this way, it's because life, through whatever process, whether it's the aging process or through a contemplation or through circumstance making it blatantly obvious to us, life has taken away, undone some of the deeply ingrained beliefs that cause the resistance and cause the unhappiness.
Don't look forward to after 50, enjoy 20s.
Yes, Dave.
Hi. So one thing, I have one comment and a couple questions from a year and a half of contemplating. But one thing I found recently is, I think you touched on it yesterday, but it was like the idea that the difference between not doing, kind of in reference to the last comment, like that happened with my dad too. He mellowed out when he was older, but sometimes he completely didn't. So it's like really, but I guess what I'm saying is, when I studied spirituality for years, I kind of assumed I would just be more monk-like as I got older. And then realizing that non-doership and not doing are very different, kind of like the Microsoft CEO thing. In my case, I'm reading this book called The War of Art, which is completely duality. It's like overcome resistance and be creative, or overcome resistance and be political, whatever it is that your heart tells you. But I don't see a conflict now, finally, with non-doership and that. It's like there's we're living in duality, so you kind of do what you think is right in the moment for your happiness. And then the ultimate understanding is that book got introduced to me. So then I'm taking tons of actions all the time, political or artistic, but still kind of relaxed about the outcome. So that's one experience. But also, I think if I hadn't gotten knocked on my ass a lot, I wouldn't have been interested in that. So I do think that things getting taken away from you does motivate. So that's my comment.
Okay, can I just add on the comment? So getting knocked on your ass is part of your history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So each time you fall on the ground, that's new conditioning, which then becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. And then someone presents the book to you, and the book seems appealing based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment. If you hadn't been knocked on your ass a few times, your genes and up-to-date conditioning would be different. And if someone presented that book to you, you might find a different reaction. It's like, nah, that doesn't sound interesting. So just to put it in the context of, and then you correctly said that once the book seemed interesting, you read it, and each page you were reading, each line you were reading is new conditioning. That then adds to your up-to-date conditioning, and you find yourself functioning according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning that you then start putting into action things that the book suggests this could be a good way of functioning. You put it into action. There's an outcome. That outcome is part of the new conditioning in life, becomes part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and you then continue to function that way. So would you agree with?
Yeah, I think like the number one most essential understanding in my like non-dual search was I used to hear these top-down teachings, everything that's happening is just happening. So then I would kind of almost try and freeze and let life live me and like wait almost. Mm-hmm. And then that was really destructive. It almost led to a depression or like I'm not good enough because this blissful thing hasn't happened to me yet. And then it was
hasn't happened to me either.
Yeah. So it was really attachment to outcomes, and this one, the experience was like this golden jewel that I thought, and so that was really painful. And then when the realization, just do whatever you think will make you happy, which was a concept you introduced to me, it was just like much simpler. There was no, I have to freeze or I have to not do, nor was there any waiting anymore. It was just do whatever you think's right, and it actually is pretty simple because, as you say, that's what we do anyway. Mm-hmm. So that was one comment I want to make, but this is like a kind of essential one for me that I wanted to ask you about for a while. It's like basically everything in life is either some version of pleasure or pain. So isn't having an attitudinal shift away from suffering just maximizing your pleasure and kind of selfish? And if so, that's good news because I'm selfish in that way. But like, it's really not that there's this thing attitudinal, which is outside and holy, and it's just That's life.
That's life. Yeah. So, okay. So, do you need to elaborate more? Because at this
No,
point,
that's basically it, yeah.
There's a good. Yeah. So, you might have realized that a lot of people might realize that the concepts are very specific in the teaching, and sometimes we miss the specificity of it. So, what it says is the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. Your attitude to the flow of life is where our suffering or peace lies, right? So it creates a distinction between the flow of life and your attitude to the flow of life. But life overall is different from the flow of life. So the flow of life is referring to the circumstance. Life overall encompasses both flow of life and attitude. So, as you very rightly say, in life, our life experience, the attitude and the circumstance are never really separate. They come hand in hand. But then if we've created a distinction, the flow of life is always pleasure or pain, and then there is your attitude to the flow of life. That then means that the attitude to the flow of life is outside of the spectrum of pleasure and pain. But it's not independent of the flow of pleasure and pain. So maybe that gives the distinction you require, because I think before you were saying not necessarily seeing the distinction of flow of life and just saying life, and hearing that it says life is always just pleasure or pain. And therefore, if attitude is part of life, then attitude has to be either pleasure or pain. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now with the distinction that we say, okay, the flow of life, meaning circumstance, is always either pleasure or pain. Then there is your attitude to the flow of life, and both the flow of life and your attitude to the flow of life fits into life overall. And that doesn't change the fact that change in attitude is still an optimization of life, which is what your basic conclusion was. Isn't a change in attitude just making life better? And yes, I agree, but the optimization is not, and who's it making it better for? It's making it better for Roger or for Dave. So it's personal, it's better, and so on that level, you could, I prefer to use the word self-fullness than selfishness. Mm-hmm. Selfishness is very loaded and has a specific connotation. And so on this basis, we can see, this process is a process of optimization. It is a process of basically where life becomes better, but we're still creating a very important distinction. Where is this betterness? It's not a betterness on the circumstance, pleasure and pain, but on the attitude, which, when we really drop all conceptual distinctions, we say, well, there is no distinction. It's just all life. So the process is a betterment of life. It is an optimization of life. But from the teaching point of view, we still need to make it clear that that betterment of life is not dependent on you having a perfect circumstance.
So yeah, I get that it's not. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's a little esoteric. I was kind of thinking like attitude is a thought form, so that's also part of the flow of life. But it doesn't, it's kind of conceptual. Ultimately, circumstance isn't going to lead to your ongoing happiness, and attitude is, that's the main point.
But thought forms of a psychological type, mm-hmm. right, in the framework as it's set up, wouldn't fit into the flow of life. They'd fit into life. Mm-hmm. Right? The flow of life is reserved. The conceptual category of flow of life is reserved for biological reactions.
Okay, no, that's actually that's helpful. So within the framework now I understand. Psychological is like a different.
It's still in the category of life, but not in the category of the flow of life. Psychological is the attitude to the flow of life.
No, that's good. It just, the difference there is that it's not dependent on something like holy or extra worldly.
That's right.
Okay. So that was kind of my question.
It's actually great. It's dependent on, if we go back to what I was saying, what is the human being? the human being, impersonal consciousness, one of the components, the body object, another of the components. The impersonal consciousness links to the body object, functions through it as personal consciousness, and the attitude of the heart is where consciousness rests in itself. Consciousness becomes aware of itself as the core of the human being. So on the one hand, we could say that this optimization is because of something very divine or special, but it's not unique to a particular person. It's unique to everyone, or it's common to everyone, because everyone is a person, and therefore everyone has this consciousness functioning through them. The body is what gives people their unique characteristics, which is why the sages say, when upon self-realization, I am no longer the body. So that's that it's not an absolute truth. It's just a pointing to the recognition that they have realized the aspect of the human being that is not just the body. And then at some point there's an integration that says we can't even say I'm not the body. I am not just the body. I am a person, which is a combination of the body and consciousness.
It seems to me it would have been helpful if more scriptures added the word just.
Yeah, I'll tell you why they don't. Because at a certain part in the process, we say, well, actually, I need to see it as just, not just. Sorry, excuse me. At a certain part of the process, we say, actually, that's a bit misleading. I am not the body. I need to see it. I am not just the body. But before that, it is very important to get a realization of the other component that we don't know, that is obscured. And in order for that realization to happen, teachings recognize that what's going on is that there's a heavy identification with the gross aspect of the human being, the thing that is most obvious in our experience, the external. And so how do we go about breaking that obsession with just one part of the human being? And so one way is to introduce the notion of absolute reality, for example, or bring in the concept of truth, and then we'll bring in the opposite. Okay, truth and illusion, or absolute reality and the relative, or the changing. And then they'll say, you are not the changing, you are truth, you are the absolute, you are that which doesn't change. In order to, and that sounds great. I don't want to be the relative, I don't want to be the changing. I want to be the truth and the absolute. So it's a psychological trick of a teaching to say, you are, now look for what you are. If it said, well, you are nothing, and just left it at you are nothing, then the psychological part of us says, I'm not really interested in finding myself as nothing. So let's call it truth or absolute, supreme reality, all there is. I go, I want to know myself as that. Thank you very much. And so then it's the netty process kicks in. Not this, not that. You know, you're not, anything you can see is just the relative, it's form. You're not that. You are much more than that. You are something completely different from that. In order to bring a shift onto that which is unseen, unrecognized. And so then we can see that with that methodology, which is very well considered, it's what's required, it's skillful means, comes another problem further down the track that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so it seems to me like this teaching is a bridge that I needed, because if you just leave it at that kind of Neo-Advaita, or even the Upanishads, you just read them and then it just talks about ultimate reality, and then you think you're doing something wrong.
Sure.
That's well, it's really problematic, because then you're just kind of stuck and you feel kind of cast out of the garden, actually. And so, but it seems like what you're saying here is, okay, this teaching is running interference so that you could see beyond everyday life, ultimate reality. But then what was missing for me anyway was the bridge back. So I don't know if you and Ramesh are the only, I'm sure you're not the only ones who talk about it, but you talk about it in a specific way that for me is like, thank God somebody told me that. So it wasn't just this very esoteric ultimate reality. You still thinking that you're Dave, cast out of the garden, and no one helping you make a bridge is frustrating.
Yeah, it is. Or you can find yourself in the opposite situation, which is where I found myself, which is fully identified as the formless, convinced that that was truth and reality and all that the process was about, because the teachings up to that point had only emphasized that. And that shift had happened, and it's true there was much less suffering, but there was still these remnants that needed to be fixed. And when I had my discussion with Ramesh, he essentially said, I see where you are, come back down here. And so he started talking about the person and the ego and daily life, and I was thinking, what are you talking, like, that's kindergarten. Like, we need to be recognizing the nothing and the what had presented. And thankfully, through grace, not only his teaching, but something inside was triggered by, there were some points that I had already felt before, like something's not quite right here, was a feeling I had when I was just in the, identified with the awareness and the nothingness. And why did I have that feeling something's not quite right? Probably because that's not where the process ends. And so even though there was a lot of liberation and freedom in that, from the previous standpoint, it wasn't the ending point. So something inside intuitively knew that. And so when Ramesh was saying this, a lot of it I resisted and thought he didn't know that experience or that state. But then he said some things that hit the points that intuitively deep down I was feeling. And so then there was an interest for me to explore it more. And I found that, wow, if this teaching that Ramesh put forward didn't come into my life, it, depending on grace and what the story was like, I could have really spent a life for many years of what turns out, if we stay there too long, to be a dissociation from the human being that we are, that we always have been, even when we think we're not the human being, because we're now identified with the aspect of the human being that we didn't realize before, the formless, and our attention is not looking at the body. It almost feels like the body doesn't exist anymore. And yet it's the thing sitting on the chair while we think it doesn't exist. And so at some point, if we stay out there too long, it becomes a dissociation and not where daily life is meant to be lived. Daily life is interhuman relationship. So we absolutely have to come back into the body. And so what you say is spot on, that this framework dovetails in with all the other teachings, and that's why I see that the process that we go through, we get shoveled through a process. It's a mystery at how we get shoveled through it. And yet, when you listen to people's stories, there's a commonality in it. There's a commonality of the different stages, the different bus stops, if you like, and how it feels there, and how the process just unfolds on its own. And even when we feel like the process isn't working, that we're stuck, at some point we pop out of that phase and we realize, oh, we were never stuck, really. That was a very necessary part of the process, that without that, I wouldn't be able to have the realization that I now have. So what you're talking about is a realization based on certain experiences you had within the process. So,
go ahead.
So the where I get stuck is, it seems to me that from just listening to your story of how there was a really definite pre-Ramesh, there was a really definite, clear not only seeing, but not a believing, but a knowing.
Mm-hmm.
I am not the body. I am, not like I am Roger, but uppercase I.
Mm-hmm.
I am. Like the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal I am. So, and from there you went to Ramesh's teachings, which kind of flipped it and brought you down to earth.
Mm-hmm.
So where I find myself is that taking the Nisargadatta teaching and the Ramesh teaching is like, I find myself, it's like I feel like I have a stack of proof that I am. I could write a book about it. But it's like the snake, I could kind of see that it's a rope, but I can't find the angle to completely confirm that it's a rope.
Mm-hmm.
I would bet all of my savings on it. I would bet, but to me that feels like, and again, I appreciate, I wouldn't be here if I didn't appreciate this angle on the process too.
Mm-hmm.
But where I get stuck is I feel like, well, isn't it really necessary to completely see that it's a rope?
Mm-hmm. Which means completely see that I am that you are saying, which I agree, I had seen prior to going to see Ramesh. Right.
Yeah, to completely see that the impersonal I am is the only truth in the manifestation.
What that does is, in a way, it says, so what use is this teaching? Where is it applicable? Right? And so from my experience, this teaching is amazing in that it was put together by a man who at that stage was over 60, had spent his whole life as a banker, working as the managing director of the Bank of India. And he said when he retired, having been a seeker for his whole life, having been interested in this topic, having had several gurus and not having got a straight answer from them that had given him what he was looking for, he said, I'm going to address this topic for myself practically, not esoterically. He didn't want to talk about whether there are Martians on Mars, because he said, I can't see that. I'm on Earth. No point talking about whether, let me look at what I can see here on Earth. So he started looking at it. Mind you, this is also in conjunction with his time. He did have a guru that did provide him with a lot, which was Nisargadatta. And yet the exploration he talks about is the very practical daily living exploration. So being a banker, he said, if you're a banker, and he finished off as the managing director of the Bank of India, so he was a high-level banker needing to look after a whole bank organization. He said, as a banker, you can't not be practical. If you're not practical, you go broke. So he had the training to be practical. And so in my experience, and he was also well-educated, could speak English, went to London universities, and had a mind that was calculated. So when he put together the concepts, he put together a very calculated and specific set of concepts that saw life, looked at life as it was, and used the words very specifically. So when I got to Ramesh, it was a framework that allowed any misunderstanding that was put in place by a teaching that wasn't so interested in the particulars, because it wasn't important for that teaching. It allowed any of those to be pointed at and said, hey, why do you have that belief? Are you sure that belief is true? Have a look, see if it's really true. And the pointers pointed you as to how to look without, being able to get too far off track. Because if you were too far off track, eventually the pointer would come up and say, no, it doesn't say that. It says that very specifically. So it can very much, from my own experience, be a teaching that integrates after the awakening. I have no doubt at all that prior to an awakening, the teaching itself allows us to observe. It asks the person to do the observation. It allows the person to observe what is right in front of them in their own daily life, and it allows the intellect to see that the descriptions are accurate and not necessarily how we had seen life previously. And seeing that for yourself before any awakening automatically undoes what is the veil to the self. And so you can imagine if you're following a process, following pointers that are specifically designed to highlight the ignorance, the mistake, highlight what life is right in front of us, which we don't tend to see because of the way life has designed us. And if we recognize that that itself is the veil, that itself is the obstacle, then we can see that this is not necessarily just useful after an awakening, after realization. And so then that leads me on to the point about awakening itself. Is awakening in a profound way when we recognize the aspect of the human being that hasn't been recognized before, is that necessary? A lot of people in non-dual paths, especially teachings, speak about that awakening as being the most important point. So much so that we think it's the end point often. Whereas luckily now we have teachings that come in and say that's just the beginning. And when we hear it spoken about from a perspective that was, or described, or an experience described that was a particular profound or experience that looked a certain way, then we think, oh, my awakening needs to look that way also. And I am quite sure that even though I had a profound awakening along the way, so I could find myself fitting into the category I'm just talking about, but when I look at the process more and more, I see, and I've spoken to people who have a complete understanding. A very good friend of mine, who was also with Ramesh, has a complete understanding. He didn't have an awakening of that sort. He said, it's just so obvious to me that I'm not the doer. So I can't think that way. And I said, yeah, but what about the realization of the consciousness that functions through you? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. And this was very important for me because at first I thought, he hasn't realized what's most important. And then I keep going back to this point. What are we really looking for? We're looking for happiness in daily living, the end of suffering. And I ask him, do you suffer? He says, no, I believe him because I spend time with him. I see how he lives. And I see that on that level we have the same experience, the end of suffering. My process included a profound awakening realization. His didn't. It makes sense that your awakening can be very gradual, where little things fall into place, and you might have just little insights here and there. And as a cumulative effect of little insights, it's the same as having big flashes. But if we think that it's about a big flash, and then we don't have that, we might think, I'm missing that. But actually you're not. Maybe you've had those insights. And it could be something as simple as an expectation of how the process needs to unfold that gets in the way. So it might be just one or two or three small versions of the different forms of suffering that need to be cleared out. Maybe with another teaching to this, or maybe with the particulars of this teaching that we're talking about now. And so imagine if you're on a big ship, a cruise ship, the Queen Mary, and you're facing north, and suddenly the hand of God comes down and picks the ship up, turns it around and slams it back down again. Now you're facing south. And everyone on the ship is turning, bang, bang, bang. 1 minute you're looking at the mountain, next minute, no mountain. On the shore, mountain on the shore. And the ship gets turned around, and then no mountain. And it's like, wow, that was a profound shift. And what if the Queen Mary just turns, instead of God's hand coming down, lifting it up, turning it around, plonking it back down again, what if it turns, still with God's hand, but he's just pointing it, his finger on the bow, turning the Queen Mary just very slowly, 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 gradual, where each day you get up and it's just a slightly different angle of the mountain, and then the mountain's out of view, and then turned around the other way, and it's taken a bit longer, but you're pointing the other way. It still happened, but qualitatively very differently. And when I say it's taken a bit longer, not at all necessarily longer in the overall scheme of things, because you can have an awakening that's instantaneous. Even when you have small insights that can deliver the full understanding, the insight is always instantaneous. It's a shift that is not intellectual. It required the intellect. The intellect was part of the laying the groundwork for the final click. And those clicks are something very simple. We've had thousands of them in our spiritual journeys. And in the overall scheme of things, if you have a big shift, you can sometimes have a very long integration process afterwards, because you have a teaching that brings about the shift, and then the integration might take a long time, because the teaching that brought about a profound shift doesn't talk about what's after it. And we might find ourselves still identified with the formless, thinking that that's it. And so afterwards it might take a long time. Whereas someone who had a different path with lots of little insights, they sort of find themselves there once they realize, oh, all I'm looking for is the end of suffering, and they realize their suffering has sort of fallen away. When it arises, it gets cut off much quicker. And at some point they say, who cares that there's a little bit of suffering that arises from time to time? More or less it's ended, or it's ended completely. And no big awakening and no obvious integration. It just happened, both the awakening and the integration happened simultaneously. So even though, overall it doesn't necessarily even mean it's going to take longer.
So there's no rules. In other words, it can go in. See, on paper I know that, but I think that if I'm honest, there's an addiction or a like the sexy awakening of somebody like Eckhart Tolle, just about to off himself, and he wakes up and he's in a room full of diamonds, the plants look like diamonds, and he spends, a long time ago I let go. What was that? Something he ate. Intellectually, a long time ago, I let go of that, reverie. It's like, it happened in my sleep. I'm fine. I don't need bliss. Take me whenever you like. Mm-hmm. But I think you've kind of answered the question already. But what's nagging at me is that I feel like I have. You talk about puncturing through. I feel like I have so many little. I have a list of, like, it should be. I should be certain. I should be certain. Maybe I am certain, and I'm convincing myself that I'm not certain. Mm-hmm. It's.
Yeah, so you know how it is. You might have an idea about what source is, for example, a concept, a notion of what source is. And if that notion is a little bit off, it can then affect your whole framework that we carry around about what things are. And if that's the case, then although we've seen a lot of things, what's remaining will be the obstacle. And if that's the case, then the obstacle is there. The question is, what is required to undo the remaining obstacle? And the answer is, I have no idea, as in specifically. But in general terms, we say, that's the obstacle. A false idea, or even a false idea just of the framework. And life needs to deliver what it needs to deliver to crumble that, maybe slowly, bit by bit, or maybe it just needs one hit and the whole thing will crumble. And the way the process is you can be on the 99th step of 100 steps, and you don't, and let's say you're in the dark, and you don't know it's the 99th step, but you're just one step away. Or you could be on the 50th of 100, right? And so at some point you go, well, I'm just going to keep taking the steps as life lives me to take those steps. What more can I do? And the thing is, if you've seen that the process is happening, that insights are happening, that sure, I'm getting stuck in the flop from time to time, but that's part of the process. And you look back and you go, wow, my life has been dedicated to this search. What better project can you dedicate your life to? We sometimes feel like, oh, I'm wasting my life because the people around me don't understand what's going on. They tell me that I should be getting a job or getting on with living life as other people live life. And something inside is driving me differently, and often the doubt can kick in and say, oh, I think they might be right. No, this is the most valuable project that you could dedicate your life to.
That's what I needed to hear.
Yeah.
Can I make one comment, a quick one, and then I hand the mic back to the gentleman in the front, because this is directly,
Sure.
I mean, relating subjectively to this gentleman.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. The quick comment is because I directly relate to your sentiment. So rightly or wrongly, I believe there is an option. And I, again, rightly or wrongly, act on that. So that was the quick comment. I mean, I've been whatever spiritual seeking for a long time. And exactly, that's the point. I mean, where is this glamorous, sexy, or realization of formlessness, source of whatever? So there was this different option discussed, and then the third option, is, you get some help from drugs, from substance. And I act on that in my case, and that is fairly recent. Within a year or two ago, I participated in a couple of ayahuasca ceremony. And to some extent, that actually gave me that. And then, yeah, sure, I got that, and then I still do the other stuff, like coming here. So that was the option.
Yeah, part that. Okay.
Well, you started off with a statement that you were going to get into relationship and daily living. We kind of got off the track from that.
Mm-hmm.
I just because when I started this journey back in the early 70s, I got very, very involved for a decade just on Krishnamurti. And he hammered in his whole life about truth is a pathless land, but he also really hammered on life is revealed, you are revealed, relationship will reveal your true being. Or you look for truth. I'm kind of contradicting myself. He emphasized relationship, and I'm wondering, do you have any 3 pointers that you could quickly give us how we maneuver or steer through life through relationship to help us find these sources of unhappiness? Is that what you were going to?
Yeah, we're looking for happiness in daily living. What is daily living? Daily living is interhuman relationship. So really, we're looking for happiness in interhuman relationship. What is happiness in interhuman relationship? Happiness in interhuman relationship essentially means harmony in interhuman relationship. It doesn't mean the other doing what you want them to do, or you doing what the other wants you to do. It means both people functioning the way they're designed and us finding a harmony with that. That's the happiness that's available in interhuman relationship. So if we come to see, that's what interhuman relationship is, and happiness or peace of mind in interhuman relationship is a harmony, not on a biological level, but on an attitudinal level with what's happening. Then we can continue living life, which is into human relationship, we can see when there isn't a harmony. We can see that the harmony is on a biological level, on a circumstantial level, obviously going to be the case all the time. The other is not always going to do what you want them to do. You're not always going to do what the other wants you to do. So that makes sense. It doesn't make sense that that is somehow magically going to change, where the other does what we want and we're always doing what the other wants. We go through life and we see the disharmony on the attitudinal level. And when we see the disharmony on the attitudinal level, it becomes an opportunity for us to question what is the attitude that is happening in this moment that is creating disharmony. And we'll find that the attitude is one of personal doership, where we project onto the other that they are in control, and we forget that life is a story unfolding as it's destined to unfold. We see that we think we're in control, a separate independent entity. We forget that we're part of a story of life unfolding. And we see the attitude is also an attitude that says my completeness is dependent on life looking a certain way in this moment, the other functioning the way I want them to function, me functioning the way I want.
Okay, so it's really, the relationship becomes a reflection of you understanding your discomfort or your unhappiness. It reveals it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Back. Yeah.
Hi.
Howdy.
So I'm going to, first of all, I have to do a kind of like a mental dump of how my mind works. So this is just an amusement of mine. So a reality show that I'd be willing to watch is an enlightened being lives with the Kardashians. And I would love to see that process. And I think it would be like, great, I could use that, you know. But along with that.
Pitch it to HBC.
What?
Pitch it to HBC and we'll see what happens.
So, you know, and watch them go through this process of living and dealing with a live-in enlightened being, having breakfast with them, you know. Well, maybe it's not quite like that. But along with that, you used a word, and the word sends me, my imagination of this word, along with experience, sends me into place of wordlessness. So my two questions are, and the word you used was grace. Mm-hmm. So I immediately went, I'm going to ask him about what that's like for you. And the corollary to that is, my imagination says is that you have access all the time to a state of being in grace. And how do you talk when you have that going on? That's my question. Like, I can't find, words from that state elude me, and yet I'm going to stop there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll answer it relative to the framework, but the framework is very relevant to my experience of life. So grace is the framework. Everything that happens is happening according to God's will. Nothing is my doing or your doing. As an orchestrator, as an independent, spontaneous, as an independent volitional entity. So from that regard, everything is grace, because nothing is my doing. But then the word grace is more specifically used than that. Grace is usually a word used for those things that are clearly not our doing, that delivers something very positive, and grace in this context, something very positive in regard to a movement towards a recognition of our true nature, or in practical terms, a movement towards the end of suffering. So grace is when I trip over a log and I fall, and what I fall into is a note that tells me exactly what I need to know. Right? So there is grace in that. I didn't orchestrate it, and had I not tripped over, I would have missed the treasure. And so when is this shift, and I don't even like using the word shift because it makes it seem like something that happens one day and then everything is different. And frankly, anyone who says there is no process, unless they are doing it very specifically as a teaching, which is a very valid teaching, and they don't believe that to be truth, because a teaching isn't truth, it's just a concept. Unless someone is saying there is no process as a part of a teaching with a deep understanding of that, why they're saying it, they're deluded. Because the whole of life is a process. At least the fact, even if it's spontaneously now, there's a memory included in the now. A memory that I don't create, it's just there. So it creates the impression of a past. And the liberated person doesn't suddenly find themselves absent of memory. That's not a component of the present moment that falls away. What falls away is an identification with what happened in the past, but there's still a memory there. And so even after liberation, this is still a story of time where a past is apparent in the present moment. And so that means that, yeah, I can say that when I was 10, I lived in Malta, and when I was 25, I came across a book that was very instrumental, and it was the beginning of the process. Really, the beginning of the process was my birth, and then the beginning of the process might have been many stuff before that, who knows. So it's all a process. And when is something going to happen in the process? And I'd say ultimately it'll happen according to grace. So every significant and more everything, but the significant points that we go, wow, that was not my doing and it was life-changing. Grace. So that's what I mean by it'll happen when it's destined to happen, and it's grace when it happens.
You made the comment, I was talking to Ramesh and then grace, and then you went on to use a whole series of other words. Was there, I don't know if that's even thing, was that an embodied aha that holistically integrated experience of being in a state of grace, and from that emanated a shift? You said
so.
I
think
use that word.
I think I probably use the word grace as I came to Ramesh by grace, maybe, or it was grace that Ramesh and his teaching came into my process, something like that.
Well, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because I don't necessarily remember what I would call a state of grace where suddenly something changed. I do. So I don't think I use the word grace as a state of grace.
Okay.
I use the word grace as meaning when something is delivered from outside, and that is delivered from outside has a very significant consequence. Then I'd say, well, that definitely wasn't my doing, and it was grace. We could say if someone is miraculously cured of something, we could say that they were cured by grace. Technically, a scientist would rightly argue, well, actually, maybe it's not grace. Maybe it's a sort of cause and effect that we don't understand. And I'd say, yeah, I'd call that grace too.
Great.
Yeah. So the speaking, does that? How can you speak from a place? Because we can find ourselves dropping deep, deep, deep into a place of being where it makes no sense to speak because the person falls away, the sense of being someone in particular falls away, the world essentially falls away. And that can happen with our eyes closed, or we could even do it with our eyes open. And when that happens, where's the point of speaking? Because there's no problem in a sense. We've retreated so far back that there's no questions and there's no problem. And yet daily living gets lived from a place of connection to source, a connection of being, but not where not where we've withdrawn in a sense as far out of daily living as can happen in particular times during the day or in meditation. And so then we get to live as a very ordinary human being. If someone says, oh, I have this problem, inside there isn't this sense, I don't know what you're talking about. It's understood from where they are that they have this problem, and if there's a relative answer to that problem, it gets delivered. My feeling is that for a long time, I can't see anything that I say or anything anyone else says or does other than a movement through a particular body-mind that is designed to deliver exactly what is delivered. And so I see it as life unfolding, or Roger being lived to speak the way that he speaks. And Roger, the doer, essentially has got out of the way, has been dissolved. And in situations like this, I find myself I'll be able to talk for 2 or 3 hours because the words just come out. And so I quite interestingly feel connected to Source, understand it's Source moving through us at any point in time, witnessing the speaking happening, and seeing that the speaking is always inspired by something before it. If the question didn't come, the answer would not come. And I might feel it compelled to say something different based on the circumstance as it stands.
I guess maybe I missed. Oh, thanks. Just very quick. So you started to talk. I thought you were going to address how to make decisions.
Yes.
And I want to get back to the movie. It looked like 2 great questions, and I heard them as, how do you move towards decision making based on moving from the source and not from the sense of doership? Okay. The second thing you mentioned, I thought, was that ignorance or error is somehow inhabited also somewhat in the body itself. Mm-hmm. I thought you said that, and I was kind of looking forward to hearing it.
Yeah. Yes. So ignorance is part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So from a practical daily living point of view, the genes and up-to-date conditioning are in the body. So, our up-to-date conditioning includes the fact that we can speak English. Why do we speak English? Because we've been impacted by the language that our parents were speaking, and as a child we grew till the point where a word popped out. And then another word popped out. And if you're a parent, you go, oh, I wonder, how did all of that suddenly start popping out? And it becomes very apparent. It's a process of the person being conditioned, being exposed to certain things. We don't suddenly start speaking Japanese if we've been exposed to the English language and vice versa. And so the error is the same thing. It's a conditioning that comes either from something carried forward and inserted at birth, meaning a packet of information that comes not from conditioning in this life, but from somewhere else, from conditioning that happened previous to this. And on top of that, conditioning, I wouldn't necessarily insist that that exists, except I've had plenty of experiences that say that my framework has to include that component because it doesn't make sense that it came from conditioning in this life. I had no conditioning that supported certain energetic memories that presented themselves. So it was in the body. This body didn't ever live another life, but it seems like the information from other circumstance is somehow contained in this body. And that information from other circumstance, the information that tends to get carried forward is misunderstanding about who we are. The attitude of relating to past circumstance with the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And as things happen, as our parents tell us, no, you can't do this, or our parents forget to pick us up one day. It's a circumstance, and in the moment, the relationship is, what have I done to be abandoned? I must not be good enough. That's why I've been left alone. And the fear, I'm going to be here on my own forever because I'm not worthy, let's say. And then half an hour later, the parents turn up. But that attitude to the circumstance may be locked away. So that becomes part of the ignorance, a mistake about who I thought I was. Oh, I'm not good enough, that's why I've been abandoned. And that mistake, even though the circumstance then shows us, oh no, you were wrong, I'm loved, I've been picked up, that may not get released. Or if we were never picked up, if we were completely abandoned at some point, then that mistake, because we weren't abandoned because we weren't fundamentally good enough, but if that was what was locked away, then that becomes part of the ignorance, the not knowing my true self, and it's in the body. And at some point it can come out. So it looks like that will be this afternoon session to talk about that, because it's an interesting session in itself. Decision making looks like it will be this afternoon's topic also, because it's an important session. And so just to wrap up, I see you had a comment or a question?
It's fine. It's
okay.
Okay. Well, also I was going to say that this teaching seems to me, it was related to what you were saying about, in meditation, or when you get really deeply remembering self, and then you go out into your daily life, which is not always as optimal as you might like it to be. This teaching seems to me very practical, and I guess that's why it is, bridge to sort of be able to carry insight or knowledge more into one's life by remembering how to focus thought or question thought so as to keep remembering. So it's not just one's experience of self is not limited to when you're alone and silent and quiet. So
exactly. What's the point if that was the case? This shift, this realization, this transformation has to deliver a practical benefit in daily life. So it's not about something that delivers some sort of benefit in a partition of your life when you're sitting in meditation. That might be the beginning of how it becomes something taken out into daily living, but ultimately it needs to be something that delivers a practical shift, a practical benefit. And that is, practically speaking, the end of suffering, or the reducing of suffering, the cutting off of suffering quicker and quicker, because the working mind starts to become equipped with an understanding of what the different functionings feel like, look like, and from which roots the various functionings stem. So, for example, guilt, blame, pride, stemming from the belief in personal doership. Is that an accurate assessment of myself and how the other function? If we see, no, it's not. Everyone's functioning exactly the way they're designed. Expectation, attachment, that's based on a deeply ingrained idea that I need things from the outside that I don't have to complete me. Is that accurate? As we start connecting to ourselves, we find, in this moment I feel complete, and I don't have anything more than I had yesterday. So we start to see proof, I am complete even without outcomes. So, Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.